and welcome to the podcast. So I know we said we'd have all three hosts in this episode, but unforeseen stuff can happen. So as a result, it's only me, Rohan. But today we're talking about an interesting topic that shaped the world as we know it, the modern world. What if Napoleon never conquered Europe? So Napoleon was this guy. He was born on Corsica, which at the time was actually not part of France. His father was a noble, and so he got him a scholarship into a very prestigious military academy. So Napoleon was actually bullied as a kid, kind of, because he couldn't speak French properly. Like, he could speak it, but he wasn't very fluent as a native speaker is, per se. So by the time he graduated, he joined the military, and he stayed with the military until the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, where he headed back to Corsica as it was stable compared to France, because obviously it was independent back then. He stayed there until 1793, when the French Revolution was kind of cleaning up, per se. So he headed back to France, which was still in total chaos, but the monarchy was deposed by then. Just different power groups were trying to figure out who would rule France and how we would rule France. So he actually participated in the French Revolution after 1783 between the different factions. He helped Augustin Robespierre in the siege of Tours, and Robespierre was actually this very scary guy. He had a bunch of people executed and saying there were enemies of the state, and he had everyone guillotined, basically. It was a terrible, terrible time. But anyway, during the French Revolution, other countries also invaded France, trying to take advantage of it. So he went with Robespierre to the siege of Toulon, where he helped capture the city from the British, who had actually already taken it. And he was promoted to a brigadier general at age 24. He also went on to lead the army of Italy and even helped lead them into the Habsburg monarchy, or modern-day Austria. And he tried to invade them, but it didn't work, but he would get his revenge in a year. But by the time he went back to France, it was 1799, and France was still in turmoil. So he staged a coup and became the first consul of the new French Republic. One of his first things he did in 1800 was seize Switzerland and Italy, and also sign a peace treaty with the British 2 years later. They would fight again, though, after the British violated some of the agreements in these treaties. This episode is sponsored by Anchor, a free podcast host.
A podcast host is a website that allows you to upload your episodes and distribute. And what makes Anchor special is that it distributes for you, ladies and gentlemen. As soon as you click submit for your podcast, Anchor automatically sends it to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other platforms.
Best of all, you can make money with no minimum listenership.
It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place, including on your phone.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
In 1804, Napoleon changed his name from the first consul to the first French emperor, and this caused anger against other empires and republics, like the British Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. All these rulers in Europe, they had one thing in their mind, and that was to eliminate Emperor Napoleon. As a result, Napoleon responded by assembling an army of nearly 200,000 men by 1805, and after a year, he defeated the Third Coalition, which was the British and the Holy Roman Empire mainly. And as a result of this war, the Holy Roman Empire actually fell, though it would be a few months later when the Fourth Coalition formed, and wars upon wars would happen. Eventually, Napoleon would be defeated with the Sixth Coalition by Russia invading. Then he'd get sent to exile on an Italian island. And then he would come back, take control of France, and the Seventh Coalition would form. And finally, at the Battle of Waterloo, his empire would fall, and he would be exiled on a British island this time instead of an Italian island, so he could not escape. So now, what if Napoleon never conquered Europe? Or what if France never became a continental power? Well, history of Europe would change a lot. So with this thing, we're going to say that Napoleon's attempt of a coup in 1999 actually fails, and as a result, he's persecuted for his actions and he's cast out of this scenario, per se. So he's dead or he's exiled forever. What the point is, he's out of this scenario now. So most historians agree that as a result, the French Revolution would actually not continue, but only worsen. And I think this is true too, because Napoleon, he actually fixed the turmoil in France because the current government was just executing people left and right. As I said, even though it's coming to an end, there is still in so much chaos. So Napoleon actually helped stabilize the country. So without Napoleon, I think France would just be in a whole lot worse situation with constant turmoil and instability. They might even plunge into a full civil war between the different factions. Because right now there was violent outbreaks and peaceful outbreaks, but it wasn't a full-scale civil war like it could break out to. So I believe that the factions actually would just resulted in civil war in France, and France would just be out of the way for some time. Also, one thing important to note is that the Louisiana Purchase for America, which actually expanded the United States from the 13 colonies to a lot of land west, Napoleon sold that land because he needed money for his armies. So if the French Empire the French people, they fell into a civil war, they might have sold it, definitely, but it would have not been the scale to Napoleon. They probably would have sold a few territories, but not their whole like American countries' possessions. So as a result, the United States would not be as large for some time as it is today. Eventually, it would fall into the American hands, but it would be a lot different. Another thing is that the Holy Roman Empire would at least remain in power for at least another half century or a few more years after that, because they fell because of the Third Coalition collapsing with the French Empire, beating them. Also, another thing is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The only reason they actually formed, and not many people know this, is because Napoleon formed his own empire, the French Empire. So the Habsburg monarchy would not actually be very influential in European history either if Napoleon wasn't there. Also, there would probably be more war in the 1800s than there was in our timeline because of the Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo actually resulted in European nations making all kinds of agreements to prevent a war. And of course, those agreements didn't last until the First World War, but at least they prevented a major scale war in Europe in the 1800s. Like no second British-French Empire. I mean, just wars between the different European powers. Another thing to note also is Prussia, because Prussia in our timeline forms Germany. However, with the Holy Roman Empire not collapsing the way they did, because in our timeline they collapsed into the Confederation of the Rhine, Holy Roman Empire, they can rebuild themselves, because in our timeline Prussia actually helped Germany rebuild, and as a result they also eventually took over Germany. However, with the Holy Roman Empire still standing, they would be able to rebuild themselves, and Germany would not form, most likely. Or at least for a long time, not until the late 1800s or to the early 1900s. So the First World War might not even have happened, or it'd be a lot different than we see in our timeline. Maybe the First World War would be between the United States and Britain, let's say trading dispute or something. So it wouldn't be full-scale war because, as I mentioned earlier also, those agreements that were set after the Napoleonic Wars did not happen, so there would still be small-scale wars here and there. So yeah, also, yeah, France would not sabotage its Spanish Empire because with Napoleon, he was able to get the Spanish people to trust him into an alliance, and then after that, he quickly deposed the Spanish Empire and replaced it with his brother. So Joseph wouldn't meet the Emperor of Spain, and as a result, the Spanish Empire would not collapse also as quickly as it did in our time, because by sabotaging the empire from actual Iberian Peninsula, it only accelerated the collapse because Spain was on the out, but it happened quickly. And yeah, without North America, as I said earlier, the French territories in North America would not have been given as easily to America, or not as much would have been given. Also, the Spanish Empire. Spanish Empire would have been different because, well, they still existed. They were still pretty strong. So they would actually be able to hold on to the territories better. So independent nations like Mexico, Venezuela, or that stuff would not be able to exist. So yeah, as I said, independent nations in North America and Central America and South America that were owned by the Spanish Empire would not exist until much later. So maybe even to the mid to the late 19th century, compared to in our time when they fell apart in the early 18th century. And also, Louisiana, the whole Louisiana territory was actually given to the French because Napoleon took over Spain, per se, like he made it a puppet. But because actually Spain still exists, it would be in Spanish hands, and they would not give it up to the Americans, no doubt. Like Florida, let's say Florida, Texas, they would have a tighter grip on their territories in North America. And it would be a long time till the United States could actually get it. And also, and Napoleon, he had big plans for the territory in Louisiana, but the Haiti Revolution just kind of messed him over. So he just considered it useless and just sold it for a good amount of money because he was still fighting a war, as I said. But in this alternate reality, Spain holds on to their territories because, well, it's their territories and they're strong enough to maintain it. So the US would have to buy land little by little or take some by force because their ambitions to move west were limited by the Spanish. And it would take a lot longer. So states like Texas, California, or Arizona might become states a lot longer than they did. Like example, California became a state in 48, I believe, or 1849. Well, in this timeline, they would not become a state until much later, 30, 40 years, or maybe they even never become a state. We never know. Because alternate history is just all speculative, sorry. You never know exactly what's going to happen. Because, like, if these southern stuff never become part of the United States, the issue of slavery would be a lot different. And the Civil War might still happen, and if it did, it would get crushed much easier if you're just looking at the 13 colonies in the U.S. territory that they had, if they couldn't buy anything by the time the Civil War happened. But if they got some territory in the South, we'd definitely get some more supporters. But still, the Union would be much stronger. And even that, let's talk about now going into the 20th century. Napoleon had a big effect on the 20th century because, well, as I said, Germany couldn't result, which resulted, Germany in our time, it resulted in both world wars. So without Germany, the world wars might be different. Or some other, it might not even happen, a gigantic world-scale war. And the Soviet Union might not even exist because the Russian Empire collapsed with the invasion of Germany. The modern era World War would just be completely unrecognizable. We would never be able to recognize it if we were ever placed into it because it's so different from our timeline. Napoleon just had a big impact on our world. So yeah, thank you for watching. If you have any suggestions or comments, the Twitter is @BackToThePastP1. You can leave fan suggestions for ideas, I guess topics you want me to discuss about, or even just criticism or whatever. Anyway, thank you.